Have you ever wondered what it's really like for men who age without a partner, navigating life's highs and lows all on their own? Picture this. Years pass, and while others build families or lean on lifelong companions, these men carve their own path, facing unique challenges and uncovering hidden strengths. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on the untold truth about men who age without a partner. The raw emotions, the societal pressures, the quiet victories, and the struggles no one talks about. You need to watch until the end because we're diving deep into powerful insights that might just change how you see resilience, independence, and the human spirit, whether you're living solo or supporting someone who is. Before we begin, I would appreciate it if you like this video, you can help me continue to spread the old age lesson. If you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, comment number 0 to let me know, so I can make a better video for you. Now let's get started. Number 1. The weight of expectations fades away. For nearly 4 decades, Robert carried the mantle of roles that society deemed noble but that he had never truly chosen for himself. Husband, father, provider. These were titles that gleamed with honor in the eyes of the world, yet they often felt to him like a heavy woolen coat worn in the blistering heat of a summer's day, suffocating and ill-fitting. They were not roles he had rejected outright, nor had he resented them in the way a younger man might chafe against constraint. Instead, they had settled onto his shoulders gradually, handed down by the unspoken expectations of family, culture, and time, until they became as much a part of him as his own skin. Robert was the embodiment of reliability, a man whose life ran like a well-calibrated clock. Each morning, he rose before dawn, the soft beep of his alarm pulling him from sleep to drive to a job at the local utility company, where he managed accounts and ensured the town's power grid hummed along without interruption. He paid the mortgage on time, kept the refrigerator stocked with groceries, and mowed the lawn every Saturday, the rhythmic drone of the mower a kind of meditation. His children, Emily and Daniel, grew up in a home where the lights never flickered, and dinner was always on the table by 6. His wife, Ellen, could rely on him to notice the smallest details: a car low on gas, a roof shingle loosened by a storm, the trash bins carried to the curb before the truck rumbled down their quiet street. To the outside world, Robert was the gold standard of dependability, the kind of man neighbors pointed to as an example, the kind of husband and father who held a family together like the keystone in an arch. But beneath this polished exterior lay a quieter, more complicated truth. Robert's love was not the kind that spilled out in words or grand gestures. It was woven into the fabric of his actions, silent and steadfast. He struggled with verbal expression, his tongue stumbling over emotions that felt too vast or too raw to articulate. When arguments with Ellen left the air thick with unspoken grievances, he would retreat to the toolbox, tightening a squeaky door hinge or patching a crack in the drywall, as if physical repairs could mend the intangible rifts between them. When his heart grew heavy with fears, about aging, about the dreams he'd set aside to provide, about the fleeting nature of his children's childhood, he would spend hours in the garage, sorting bolts into jars or organizing shelves, seeking solace in order when words failed him. To those who knew him, his life appeared as steady as a metronome. But to Robert, it had begun to feel hollow, like a house with beautiful walls but no warmth within. The truth, which Robert only grasped in hindsight, was that love cannot thrive on duty alone. Duty builds the structure of a life, pays the bills, keeps the roof intact, but it is vulnerability that breathes life into it. Over the years, the silences between Robert and Ellen grew longer, not born of anger but of a slow, mutual exhaustion. They had become like two actors in a play, reciting lines they no longer believed in. When the marriage ended, it was not with the crash of betrayal or the fire of a shouting match, but with a quiet resignation that was somehow more devastating. Ellen packed her belongings with care, her movements deliberate, as if folding away the last remnants of their shared life. Robert stood in the doorway, watching, his chest hollowed out not by fury but by a profound emptiness, as if the air itself had been sucked from the room. For the first time in decades, the weight of expectations lifted from Robert's shoulders. No one needed him to be the provider, the fixer, the steady hand. The absence of those roles left him unmoored, adrift in a sea of unfamiliar freedom. In that vast emptiness, a question surfaced, faint at first but growing louder with each passing day. Who am I when I am no longer living for someone else? It was a question that both frightened and exhilarated him, a riddle that felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether the fall would break him or set him free. At first, the lack of structure was disorienting. The small house he now lived in, a modest rental a few miles from the home he'd once shared with Ellen, felt like a foreign country. Its rooms were too quiet, its walls too bare, its routines unfamiliar. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Robert began to notice the freedom tucked into the ordinary moments of his new life. He brewed coffee exactly as he liked it, strong, black, with a bitterness that woke his senses, without adjusting the pot to suit Ellen's preference for a milder blend. He rearranged the living room furniture to catch the golden slant of afternoon light, placing an old armchair by the window not for guests but for himself, to sit and watch the world unfold. Books he had bought years ago, their pages yellowed and spines uncracked, found their way into his hands. He read slowly, savoring histories of forgotten wars and philosophical treatises that asked questions as big as the ones stirring in his own heart. These were not the reinventions of a man chasing youth or glory. They were small, deliberate reclaimings, each one a quiet declaration that his life was his own again. Underneath the heavy coat of expectation, Robert discovered a man he had almost forgotten. A man who relished the sharp tang of black coffee, who found joy in the way light spilled across a hardwood floor, who could lose himself in a book for hours without feeling the need to justify the time. Many men, he knew, viewed solitude as a mark of failure, a life diminished by the absence of a partner. But for Robert, it was a release, a shedding of the roles that had once defined him. He was free, not in the loud, rebellious sense of his youth, when he dreamed of painting or traveling the world, but in the quiet, grounded way of a man who had finally stopped performing for an audience that no longer existed. This is the first untold truth. When the weight of expectation fades, what remains is not emptiness but the beginning of the self. It is the moment when a man steps out from under the roles he has carried and into the possibility of who he might become. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when that newfound freedom meets the sharp edge of silence, a silence that cuts deep before it begins to heal. If you're still watching this video and finding these insights valuable, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us continue creating good content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's move forward. Number 2, silence that hurts, then heals. When the weight of expectations finally falls away, a man living alone is greeted not by peace but by something far sharper, silence. For Robert, this silence was not the gentle hush of a Sunday morning or the quiet of a world at rest. It was a presence, heavy and unyielding, a guest that lingered in every corner of his small house. In the beginning, it felt less like freedom and more like a punishment, a relentless reminder of all that was gone. He felt it most acutely at mealtimes, those daily rituals that had once anchored his life. For 35 years, the kitchen table had been a stage for the ebb and flow of family life. Ellen sat across from him, stirring her tea, her laughter or sighs filling the air like a familiar melody. His children, Emily and Daniel, had grown up beside him, their voices weaving a tapestry of small arguments, over who got the last roll or whose turn it was to clear the table, punctuated by bursts of laughter or the clatter of dishes. Even in the quieter years, when the kids had moved out and it was just Robert and Ellen, there had been a comforting hum, the rustle of a newspaper, the soft clink of a spoon against a mug, the murmur of a conversation about the day's small events. Now, Robert sat at a table set for one, the second chair empty, its cushion untouched. Out of habit, he sometimes reached for a second fork, setting it beside his plate before catching himself and returning it to the drawer with a pang of embarrassment that felt like a small betrayal. He cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs dusted with salt, canned soup warmed on the stove, a sandwich layered with whatever was left in the fridge. The food was adequate, but the silence that surrounded it made every bite feel heavy, as if the absence of voices had thickened the air. He tried to fill the void with sound, tuning the radio to news stations that droned about politics or the old jazz records Ellen had never cared for, their mournful notes curling through the room. But the voices of broadcasters and the wail of saxophones only amplified the emptiness, like shouting into a canyon and hearing no echo. The silence was not just the absence of sound, it was the absence of being seen, of being known. No one asked how his day had gone, whether the meeting at work had been a triumph or a slog. No one noticed if he left the porch light burning into the night or if he dozed off in his armchair, a book splayed across his chest like a fallen leaf. In those first months, the silence was a blade, cutting deeper with each quiet evening, each solitary meal. Loneliness, Robert discovered, does not shout, it whispers. It lives in the small, unnoticed moments. The creak of a floorboard under his own weight, the hum of the refrigerator in the dark, the way the house seemed to hold its breath when he paused to listen. The walls themselves felt like they were closing in, not with hostility but with an indifferent reminder that he was alone. Not just without Ellen, but without the scaffolding of roles that had once given his days shape. Many men, faced with this ache, rush to fill it. They chase new relationships, fling themselves into hobbies, or drown the quiet in the hum of a television left on all night. Robert nearly followed that path. He considered calling old friends, joining a book club, even downloading one of those dating apps his son, Daniel, had mentioned with a knowing grin. But something stopped him. A stubborn instinct, not born of courage but of a quiet resolve to understand what this silence was asking of him. Instead of running, Robert chose to sit with it. One evening, on a whim, he lit a candle at dinner, a small act that felt almost absurd in its simplicity. The flame flickered, casting a warm, golden glow across the table, softening the edges of the room. For the first time, the silence felt less like an accusation and more like a companion, steady and unjudging. Another night, he moved his chair to the window, eating his meal as the sunset painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson. The world outside moved on, birds flitted between branches, clouds drifted lazily, but inside, the silence began to shift. It no longer stung with the sharpness of loss but held space for something new. This transformation was not sudden or cinematic. It unfolded in fits and starts, in moments of clarity followed by days of doubt. But over time, the silence that had once punished Robert began to protect him. It no longer whispered of absence but of presence, reminding him that he was still alive, still capable of noticing the way light danced on a glass, the way a sip of coffee warmed his chest, the way a single note from a jazz record could linger in the air like a memory. The silence stripped away the noise of expectation, of performance, until what remained was his own voice, steady, clear, and unapologetic. It became a mirror, reflecting not just the man he had been but the man he was becoming. Someone who could find joy in the small rituals of a life lived for himself. This is the second untold truth. Silence hurts, yes, but given time, it heals. It is a crucible, burning away the clutter of a life lived for others until what's left is the raw, unfiltered self. For Robert, the silence became a companion, patient and free of judgment, teaching him to listen to his own heart. If you're still watching this video and finding these insights valuable, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us continue creating good content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's move forward. Number 3. The phone grows quieter. In the early months of living alone, Robert's world still hummed with connection, like a radio tuned to a familiar station. His daughter, Emily, called every Sunday at precisely 6 p.m., her voice a bright thread weaving through the quiet of his small cabin. She'd talk about her new job, the chaos of her toddler's tantrums, or the way her husband burned the lasagna last week. Robert would listen, chuckling softly, the sound of her life filling the empty spaces in his. His son, Michael, sent photos almost weekly. Snapshots of the grandchildren at baseball games, their faces smudged with dirt and joy, birthday cakes with lopsided frosting, family dinners where everyone talked over each other. Even a few old co-workers from the hardware store where Robert had worked for 30 years would call, their voices gruff but warm, suggesting lunch at the diner or a quick coffee sometime soon. These moments were lifelines, small but steady reminders that Robert was still tethered to the flow of other people's lives. He wasn't just a man alone in a house. He was a father, a grandfather, a friend, someone who mattered. But as the months stretched into years, the rhythm of those connections began to falter, like a song slowly fading out. Life, as it does, pulled everyone in different directions. Emily's Sunday calls became irregular, replaced by quick texts. Busy today, Dad, I'll call soon, or work's crazy, but I'm thinking of you. Michael's photos still arrived, but the gaps between them grew longer, and visits with the grandchildren became rare, squeezed between soccer practices and school events. Even the neighbors, who once waved cheerfully across the fence or stopped to chat about the weather, seemed to vanish into their own routines, their lives accelerating while Robert slowed. The silence of the phone became as palpable as the silence in his home. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of it, heavy and unyielding. Robert found himself checking the phone at night, his thumb brushing over the screen, scrolling through a call log that hadn't changed in days. No missed calls. No new messages. He'd set the phone down gently, as if it might break, and whisper to himself, "I should call them." But then he'd hesitate, not out of pride or stubbornness, but because he didn't know what to say. What words could bridge the growing distance without sounding like a plea? He didn't want to seem needy, didn't want to burden anyone with the quiet ache of his solitude. He imagined Emily juggling her job and family, or Michael rushing to get the kids to bed, and he couldn't bring himself to add to their load. And so, the phone sat quiet, an unspoken reminder that the world was moving on without him. This is where many men stumble, where the fading of contact can harden into bitterness. It's easy to feel forgotten, abandoned even, to let the silence twist into resentment toward those who seem to have left you behind. But Robert chose a different path, one that required courage in its own quiet way. Instead of waiting by the phone, staring at its blank screen, Robert began to write letters. Not emails or texts, but real letters, penned in his careful, slightly shaky handwriting on cream-colored stationery he'd bought at the dollar store. To Emily, he wrote about the squirrel that had taken up residence in his garden, describing its brazen theft of tomatoes and the way it chattered at him like an indignant landlord. To Michael, he wrote about the old record player he'd finally repaired after months of tinkering, how the needle scratched softly over vinyl, filling the house with jazz from his youth. Some letters he mailed, slipping them into the mailbox with a small sense of ceremony. Others he folded neatly and tucked into a wooden box in his dresser, unsure if he'd ever send them. The act of writing became a lifeline of its own. It wasn't about demanding a response or expecting a call in return. It was about reaching out, about keeping the connection alive in his own heart. Through those letters, Robert found a way to stay tethered to the people he loved without asking them to carry his loneliness. He realized that connection isn't always measured by how often someone calls back or how many visits fill the calendar. Sometimes, it's enough to hold someone in your thoughts, to pour your care into words and send them into the world, even if they go unanswered. This act of giving without expectation eased the ache in a way Robert hadn't anticipated. The phone still grew quieter, but Robert no longer felt like a ghost in his own life. He had found a rhythm of his own, one not defined by how often others remembered him, but by how consistently he remembered them. He'd sit on his porch in the evenings, a mug of tea cooling in his hands, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The silence no longer felt like rejection. It felt like space, a canvas for his thoughts and memories. This is the third untold truth. Connection changes with age. It may grow quieter, softer, less immediate, but it doesn't have to disappear. If you let go of the need to always be heard, you may discover a steadier, more generous way of loving, one that doesn't depend on the ring of a phone to feel real. Number 4, not bitter, just clear. When people learned that Robert lived alone in his 70s, their reactions often carried a predictable weight. At family gatherings, a cousin might lean in, her voice soft with concern, and say, "It must be so hard, not having anyone." At the grocery store, a neighbor might spot him in the canned goods aisle, sigh, and murmur, "Such a shame, you're all by yourself." Others were less subtle, their pity barely veiled. "Don't you miss companionship? You should get out there, meet someone." Behind their words was an unspoken assumption, as persistent as it was misguided. Solitude must breed bitterness, and a man living alone must be nursing some quiet resentment against the world. Robert heard these comments so often they became like background noise, a hum he learned to tune out. He never argued or corrected them. He'd offer a polite smile, say, "I'm doing all right, thanks," and steer the conversation elsewhere, back to the price of tomatoes or the weather forecast. But inside, he felt a quiet clarity that those well-meaning onlookers couldn't see. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry at the world, or at love, or at the people who had moved on with their lives. He was clear about what he needed, what he valued, and what he was no longer willing to sacrifice. Bitterness is a heavy thing. It clings to the heart like damp rot, feeding on old wounds and unmet expectations. It keeps a man tethered to the past, replaying grievances until they become his only story. Robert had seen bitterness in others, friends who spoke of ex-wives with venom, colleagues who cursed the world for their loneliness. But Robert refused to let that weight settle in his bones. Instead, he carried a lighter truth, one forged in the quiet moments of his solitary life. He thought back to his marriage, to the decades spent with Ellen. There had been good years, moments of laughter, shared dreams, the joy of raising Emily and Michael. But there had also been evenings where every word felt measured, like walking through a minefield. Dinners where silence hung heavier than the meal itself. Nights when lying beside another person made Robert feel more invisible than he ever did alone. He remembered the exhaustion of performing, nodding to keep the peace, swallowing his own thoughts to avoid conflict, shrinking himself to fit into a life that no longer felt like his. When the marriage ended, it wasn't with anger or betrayal, but with a quiet agreement that both of them deserved better than a half-lived life. Solitude, Robert discovered, wasn't the tragedy others imagined. It was a clearing of the fog. Alone in his cabin, he could sit with a cup of coffee and watch the morning mist lift from the trees without needing to explain himself. He could listen to his old jazz records without worrying they'd annoy someone. He could spend an afternoon reading a history book or fixing a creaky chair, not because he had to, but because it brought him joy. This was what clarity meant, stripping away the performance, the compromises, the constant negotiation of living for someone else's approval. What remained was authentic, unadorned, real. Psychologists have noted that men who embrace solitude without resentment often report lower stress and higher contentment than those trapped in strained relationships. A 2020 study in the Journal of Aging and Mental Health found that older adults who actively chose solitude, viewing it as a space for self-discovery rather than a punishment, experienced greater emotional resilience and life satisfaction. Robert didn't need a study to tell him this. He felt it in the quiet moments when he'd sit on his porch, the world soft and still around him, and realize he was at peace. Not because he'd given up on love or connection, but because he'd stopped chasing it at the expense of himself. He didn't hate women, as some assumed of solitary older men. He didn't hate love. He was grateful for the lessons his marriage had taught him, for the women he'd known along the way, for the moments of tenderness that still warmed his memories. But he refused to step back into a life of performance, nodding through disagreements, apologizing for his existence, or shrinking to keep someone else comfortable. Solitude wasn't a rejection of others. It was a protection of the man he had become. This is the fourth untold truth. Solitude does not always create bitterness. Sometimes, it clears the fog, revealing a life that is honest and unencumbered. Robert wasn't isolating himself from love or connection. He was guarding his peace, the quiet authenticity he'd spent decades uncovering. While others shook their heads at his solitary life, Robert felt no shame. Clarity doesn't need to explain itself. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply stands, steady and unapologetic. In the next part, we'll arrive at the most profound question every solitary man eventually faces. Aren't you afraid of dying alone? Robert's answer, as you'll see, is not what most people expect, and it reveals a truth far deeper than fear. If you're still watching this video and finding these insights valuable, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us continue creating good content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's move forward. Number 5. The real fear isn't dying alone. Whenever people learned that Robert lived alone in his 70s, one question inevitably surfaced, like a stone breaking the surface of a still pond. It was asked in different ways, sometimes with gentle concern, with a nervous laugh, whispered as if it were too heavy to say aloud. Aren't you afraid of dying alone? Robert never answered directly. He'd smile, take a slow sip of his coffee, and steer the conversation to safer ground. The new bookstore in town, the way the oak tree in his yard was dropping too many acorns. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because his truth wasn't what people expected, and he wasn't sure they'd understand. The truth was, Robert wasn't afraid of dying alone. The image that haunted others, a man taking his final breath in an empty room, didn't unsettle him. Death, he knew, was a solitary act, whether surrounded by others or not. What kept him awake at night, what tightened his chest in the quiet hours, was a far deeper fear, the fear of living the rest of his life unseen. For decades, Robert had been the strong one, the dependable one. He was the provider who worked overtime to keep the house running, the father who drove Emily and Michael to school and soccer practice, the husband who patched the roof and fixed the leaky faucet without complaint. He carried burdens quietly, swallowing disappointment to avoid conflict, nodding through conversations he didn't agree with, always prioritizing peace over his own voice. It was an unspoken rule, etched into the fabric of his life. Keep everyone else steady, even if it means erasing yourself. But that erasure came at a cost. There were nights in his marriage when he lay beside Ellen, the space between them wider than the bed itself, and felt more invisible than he ever did in his quiet cabin. There were dinners where he smiled across the table, playing the role of the good husband, while feeling like a stranger in his own home. The loneliest moments of Robert's life weren't the ones spent alone with a book or a cup of tea. They were the ones where he was surrounded by people who no longer saw him, where his presence was expected but his heart was overlooked. This realization reshaped his understanding of loneliness. Psychologists often describe humans as wired to fear isolation, but Robert's experience revealed a more profound truth. The real fear isn't being alone, it's being erased. It's the slow, invisible loss of self that comes from molding your life to fit others' expectations, from silencing your own voice to keep the peace. A 2018 study in Psychology and Aging noted that older adults who prioritize authenticity, living in alignment with their true selves, report higher life satisfaction than those who conform to external pressures. Robert didn't need data to confirm this. He felt it in the quiet freedom of his solitary days, where he could be himself without apology. Living alone, Robert had rediscovered his voice. He could spend an afternoon tending his garden, not because it was expected, but because it brought him joy. He could write letters to his children, not to demand their attention, but to share his world with them. He could sit on his porch and watch the stars emerge, feeling the weight of his own thoughts without needing to justify them. This was what he feared losing, not the absence of others, but the absence of himself. Robert didn't reject love or companionship. If it came again, he'd welcome it, but only if it arrived gently, without demands, without asking him to perform or shrink. He imagined a connection where he could be seen, not as the provider, the fixer, the steady one, but as Robert, with his quiet humor, his love of jazz, his stories about squirrels and record players. Until that day, he would guard his peace fiercely, because he knew what it cost to lose it. This is the fifth untold truth. Dying alone is not the greatest fear. The real fear is living unseen, misunderstood, invisible under your own roof. It's the slow erosion of self that comes from living for others at the expense of your own truth. Robert's solitude wasn't a surrender, it was a reclamation. It was the act of choosing himself, not out of selfishness, but out of a deep, hard-won respect for the man he had become. That's a wrap on our deep dive into the untold truth about men who age without a partner. We've explored their challenges, their resilience, and the powerful lessons their journeys teach us. Now, we want to hear from you. What's one thing you've learned from this video that you'll carry forward and put into practice in your own life? Drop it in the comments below. We're reading every single one. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more heartfelt and eye-opening content like this. Until next time, keep reflecting, keep growing, and we'll see you in the next video.